In this segment, we're going to briefly revisit the marginality concepts as they have to do with labor or labor as an input to production. Recall that marginality is simply considering the effect of one more unit, whether it's one more unit produced, one more unit consumed by the consumer, the final product user, or one more unit used in producing a good. So thinking about the firm as the consumer in this case. If you think back to our sandwich shop, we started with just one worker, and that worker was not using all of the available capital that we had. And so as we added another worker, we had some increase in the marginal product. As we then added another, we found that we also had some increase, but it wasn't an increase at the same rate. It was an increase at a decreasing rate. And each time we added another worker, we ended up having some increase, but it was a smaller increase till we got to the point where we had so many workers in this tiny little sandwich shop that adding more workers actually took away from our production. And we considered that in a marginal product of labor graph, such that the marginal product of labor largely declined as the quantity of labor increased. Well, the total product of labor we saw had a different relationship. It was cumulative. And so the total product of labor was rising, but at a decreasing rate. And then we saw that it began to fall. This is the total product of labor units. And it's not coincidental that at about the same point that the marginal product of labor curve is about to go negative or fall below the x-axis, that we have the same point at which the total product of labor curve begins to decline. So here, as the marginal product of labor curve is approaching the x-axis, we're still adding productivity, but it's at a lower and lower level until we get to a point where we have zero productivity being added, and then it turns negative. And that's the same point at which we end up turning negative in terms of our total product of labor curve, where we've reached the apex and start to go negative. We've been increasing at a decreasing rate, and now we're going to be decreasing at an increasing rate. Well, I want to just briefly remind us of the various metrics used here. For the marginal product of labor, we have a change in quantity, whatever the units are we're producing, divided by a change in our labor units. And that's going to give us the marginal product of labor. And we expect that to be decreasing once we've gotten to the point where we're using our production facility or our capital and technology somewhat efficiently. And at a point, we think that we may be even able to add so many workers that we end up with a negative marginal product of labor. And we want to have stopped before we reach that point. We know that we can then take and identify the marginal revenue product of labor or labor's contribution to the revenue of the firm by taking the marginal product of labor and multiplying it by the price of the good being produced. And remember, the price of the good being produced is one of the items that helps us identify the total revenue for the firm. We have to think about the cost as well. So the total cost of labor is going to equal the number of labor units times the wage. So let's think about this. The total labor units times the wage. Well, we said that total revenue was equal to price times quantity. That doesn't look a lot different than total cost being equal to some price of the input times the quantity of the input, which we largely think about as P of X times whatever the input is. So times X. That's the total cost. Well, if we want to think about the marginal expense of labor or one of the inputs, the marginal expense of the input, I in this case, or maybe it's labor, since that's what we're talking about, that's going to be equal to the change in total cost of that input divided by the change in the number of units of that input. So the marginal expense of labor is going to be the total change in the total cost of labor divided by the change in the number of labor units being used. We know that in order to reach some kind of profit maximization or some preferable point of production, we want to get to where our marginal revenue product of labor, or the revenue that we get because of labor's contribution, is greater than or equal to the marginal expense of labor. Now, we want that to be actually equal to reach optimality. However, if we have a choice between it being less than or equal, we're going to choose equal. And if we don't necessarily have the opportunity to make our units smaller, maybe the smallest unit of labor we can buy is 1 day, and we end up wanting actually 34.5 days, then we probably would stop at 34 days of labor rather than 35. Because if we breach 34.5, then we may be in a situation where the marginal expense of labor has now become greater than the marginal revenue product. So we're going to stop just short of that condition if we aren't able to break our input units down to a small enough level. Well, we know that similarly that the marginal revenue product of labor, we want that to equal the wage. And again, if we can't break that down to a small enough level so that it actually does equal, we're going to stop producing or stop using these inputs at the point where the marginal revenue product is still a little bit greater than the marginal expense or the wage, because we don't want to get to the point where the revenue is less than the wage. We always want the revenue to be greater than the cost. So we want the marginal revenue product of labor to be equal to or greater than the marginal expense of labor, as close to being equal as we can without it having gone negative. And we know that in a competitive market model, that's going to be such that the marginal revenue product of labor is going to be equal to or greater than the wage, which tells us that in a competitive market model, the marginal expense of labor and the wage are equal to each other. And we've seen that before. Well, here's just a brief reminder of the marginal revenue is equal to a change in total revenue divided by a change in the quantity of units being produced. Total revenue is also equal to the price times the quantity, just as I have over here. The marginal revenue is going to be, as I said, I meant these to be marginal cost and total cost for a moment, so let me rewrite these. We're going to have marginal cost generally being equal to a change in total cost divided by a change in quantity, and total cost being equal, as I've noted over here, whatever the price of the input is times the number of units of the inputs. And that takes us to this point where we really want to get where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's the quintessential condition that we want to reach in this microeconomic review of the labor market. We want to get to a point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, generally for the firm. And since we're focusing on labor, the one we really want to think about is marginal revenue product of labor being equal to the marginal expense of labor, which we know in a competitive market for labor, that's going to be equal to the wage.